Welcome to Category Visionaries, the show dedicated to exploring exciting visions for the future from the founders who are on the front lines building it. In each episode, we'll speak with a visionary founder who's building a new category or reimagining an existing one. We'll learn about the problem they solve, how their technology works, and unpack their vision for the future. I'm your host, Brett Stapper, CEO of Frontlines Media. Now let's dive right into today's episode. Hey everyone, and thanks for listening. Today I'm speaking with Ori Entis, CEO and co-founder of Staircase AI, a customer intelligence and analytics platform that's raised $5 million in funding. Ori, thanks for chatting with me today.
Thanks for having me, Brett, and I'm excited to be here.
No problem. So to kick things off, could we just start with a quick summary of who you are and a bit more about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Israel. My parents moved from the U.S., from Boston area to Israel when I was 1 year old. It was supposed to be for, 3 years, ended up being, for a lot longer. So I grew up there. And then, in Israel, after the high school, you go through the military service. So I did that for a few years and then went to engineering school, studied electrical engineering and spent some time afterwards in the semiconductor industry. So I worked for companies like IBM, LSI Logic, then joined the startup world very quickly, kind of the mid-2000s. First startup, was sold to Brocade, and then kind of did a transition into the SaaS world. And in 2019, basically started kind of my journey to found Staircase AI.
So one question we like to ask whenever we speak with someone who's served in the military is, what's the number one takeaway that you had from your time in the military?
Wow, number one, I think it just makes you a little bit more realistic about life. And, in Israel, military it can get tense at times. Almost everyone sees some form of action. And after that experience, hopefully not, in a negative way, you walk out with some lessons for life. Camaraderie, that's a really strong one with your team, the soldiers that are with you. I think, early on in life, learning that you can do things that you didn't really think you could do when you're 18. It could be physical, it could be mental. And I chose to become an officer partly because I just didn't want to get too many orders. So I thought that if I become an officer, I can then give orders. But I always found out that there's always someone up, above me.
That's funny. Now, a few other questions we'd like to ask. And the goal here is really just to better understand what makes you tick. First one, what founder or CEO do you admire the most? And what do you admire about them?
Yeah. So, it's a difficult question because I don't think I admire a single person. It's more like traits that I look at people and think, wow, that's something that I want to adopt in my personal life. And there are a few of those. I think earlier on, kind of in the financial world, hearing Warren Buffett's story about, on one hand, being so successful, but yet humble about it and kind of really sticking to kind of the same home, the same car, even though, he's a, billionaire. So that's one aspect. An additional one, if you think about musicians like Tom Petty. So if you think when you're forming a band, you're kind of like a founder, an entrepreneur. And, if you look at Tom Petty's history, and I'm a big fan, and I was lucky to see his concert, one of the last concerts, he fought the record companies at the time. And that was a battle, an uphill battle, and he really changed the industry. And then when I look at maybe in the tech world, Jobs, which, I assume we all know and hear a lot, but mostly about, his ability and tenacity, that intensity, but also that perfection around, design. That I think a lot about that, when we have conversations about the design world. And then I know probably a lot are, talking about, Elon Musk and so on, but for me, there's one part of Elon Musk that I kind of look at, which is the first principles, that idea of really looking at the core reason of a problem and trying to find a solution around it. So I don't think that there's any one individual as a whole. It's more like, attributes or characteristics.
What about books? And the way we like to frame this, and we stole this from an author named Ryan Holiday, and it's called a Quake book. So he defined a Quake book as a book that like rocks you to your core. It really influences how you think about the world and really just how you approach life. Do any Quake books come to mind?
Yeah. So I think when I was a teenager, I was into sci-fi a lot. And I think 2001 was definitely kind of an eye-opener. I think a couple of things that came up, and I kind of think it's a little eerie and kind of relevant today with what's happening with AI. I think the evolutionary aspect of the story that's told there of like, prehistoric man all the way through civilizations that travel through the galaxies. And then also how computers can evolve into a level of intelligence. And, when I was growing up, the technology world was, the personal computers, things like that were just starting to kind of emerge. And it was really an interesting way of looking at the world at the time. Later on in life, I picked up some other books along the way. I think if you think about like Malcolm Gladwell, and even Kahneman about the thinking fast, thinking slow. So those concepts of like that humans are, we're kind of hackable, or like, there's just these traits that are really interesting and kind of counterintuitive. Those are really interesting to me.
Now let's switch gears and let's dive deeper into the company. So Staircase AI, can you give us the quick kind of elevator pitch of what the company does?
Yeah. So Staircase, we're at the forefront of what we call artificial customer intelligence. And we're on a mission to empower customer-facing leaders to boost retention, upsell, and conversion with the power of AI. So we're an AI-first company. And the way we do it is we examine millions of customer interactions. So think of any kind of engagement, if it's textual, voice, any data that you have in your system. And we look at a customer as a holistic, and we're talking here B2B, as a holistic kind of engagement of two networks of people, the customer and the vendor. And our AI automatically forecasts things like risk, churn, reveals concealed growth potential, and helps leaders manage the organization and really, know what's happening.
What are like the indicators that someone is going to churn, just for like an example there?
Yeah, so they're the obvious ones, which are, deteriorating sentiment, a lot of issues, but sometimes it could be something more subtle, like a change, in the personas, like an organizational change, or maybe some budget changes, or you lost a champion. So it could be that, there's great adoption of a product. And so churn can be very surprising in that respect. And what you need to do is you need to look at a lot of different parameters simultaneously. And then the forecasting, is kind of limited in time. So I always like to think about it as like weather, right? So like, we can probably forecast the weather maybe a couple of weeks in advance, maybe a little bit more. And churn is kind of like that. It's complex. Of course, you might have, a number of really kind of bad incidents with a customer. Think of like, crashes, support, issues like that. But, you might still be able to save the customer. So those are kind of the main indicators. I think to fight churn, we've put together different kinds of operating methods, right? So one is to make sure, you're responding quickly enough. Two is to make sure that, the customer is constantly seeing value. And customer in B2B is not one person. That's the challenge. You really need to kind of take a group of people, individuals from different, aspects of the hierarchy, and make sure that each and one of them sees value. It's enough that one of them may not, so that the time of renewal, you might lose that contract.
And can you take us back to 2020 when the company was first starting? What was it about this problem that made you say, yep, that's it. This is the problem that I want to solve?
Yeah, so it's an interesting journey that I had. I led product for about 2 years in a mid-sized SaaS company called Kenshu, now rebranded as Sky, and then was asked by the CEO to take over the post-sales or the customer success organization. And that was about 150 people overseeing close to $100 million of ARR, global team. And we were hitting some churn at the time, some challenges. And I remember stepping into the role, this is 2018, and I had, the best tech stack you can imagine. And I was just really challenged in understanding what's happening. So basic questions like, what is, the health of a customer? Do we have the right engagement? Are we talking to the right people? Where's the team spending the time? And, there were a lot of systems of record, but they all relied on the fact that people were going to report, into them. And everyone was really busy. So there was no real reporting happening. And I realized it wasn't, only the culture of our company, but a lot of companies were struggling with that. And it just started to think about different ways in which I could get a clear kind of intelligence view of what's happening. And that was kind of the beginning of Staircase.
What about first customers? I'm guessing that maybe that former employer of yours was the first customer, but outside of that, who were some of those first customers? Or not who they were, but how did you land them specifically? Getting people to pay you money when you're a new startup is never easy. So how did you manage to pull that off?
Yeah, so my co-founder, Lior, and I, we kind of reached out to our network at first. And you're right, Kenshu Sky was one of our first design partners. And when you're a startup at the early days, you have to rely on your network because sometimes your idea sounds a little bit crazy. And think 2 years ago, AI, a lot of people kind of looked at us like, oh, it doesn't really work, or it's not accurate, or there are a lot of false alarms. And how are you going to do it? And are we going to give you access to our data? So there were a lot of questions, a lot of challenges. And that's where you'd have to bridge, I think, those challenges with a relationship, right? So when you have a strong relationship and people know you, they'll feel confident to kind of take a risk. And on one hand, help you. On the other hand, there has to be something in it for them. So they have to have a problem. So it was mostly our close network or the network of our network, birth relationships. And those were like at the beginning, just design partners. And then after, about 3 months or so on, we got a little courageous and said, okay, yeah, are you willing to pay for this? And because the challenge with the design partner is that they don't have to pay anything. The real test, and I think that this is something that, looking forward, the real test is when you have to have someone pay for something.
Can you give us an idea of growth that you're seeing today and just any numbers or metrics that you can share?
Yeah. So the interesting thing that has happened, I think, over the past 6 months is obviously the introduction of, tools like ChatGPT and generative AI. And that has actually done, wonders for us because it's basically boosted on an individual level the ability to really understand how AI operates and that it actually works. As I said, earlier in the day when we would, say, hey, we're doing sentiment analysis with AI, we're looking at engagement with AI, we're, analyzing relationships, people are like looking at us like, we just fell off a tree. But I think today it kind of become realistic to most consumers. And then what you experience as a consumer, you can also take to your business, world. So we're seeing a lot of interest because now a lot of companies have an agenda to introduce AI into their sales, post-sales, and various other aspects of their operations. And so we get, questions like, hey, we want to use AI. We're just not really sure where, how, what. So we're seeing, quarter over quarter, we're seeing, 40 to 50% growth right now. We are seeing a lot of interest. The pipeline is very big and also bigger companies. And I think it's just a very exciting time to disrupt.
Yeah, I can see that from like the positive case when ChatGPT came out, it really entered into the mainstream and that probably helped a lot. But is there a negative side there as well where there's just a lot of noise and a lot of buzz and perhaps maybe it's a bit hard to stand out in all of that noise? Are you dealing with that at all?
Absolutely. So I think one is there's a lot of, cynicism or perhaps, are you really AI or are you just using ChatGPT? You know what I mean? And we've been deep in the world of data and AI for the past 2.5 years. So there's a little bit of convincing if it's on the investor side or if it's on, the customer side that we're not just using ChatGPT out of the box, but we actually have a serious kind of platform. And the way we explain that is, that really, and I think I just wrote a post about that. But, LLMs are amazing, but they definitely rely on the data. And, providing data to LLMs, especially in the B2B world, is not a simple task. And the more channels and the more omni-channel approach you are, providing the LLMs, it becomes more difficult. So definitely there is that hype. There's a lot of noise. So people don't necessarily know, how to differentiate between different products. But I think that I'm seeing right now kind of a little bit of the noise kind of, abate a bit. And as we gather more success stories, then the kind of the network effect in the industry, so customer referrals and things like that are definitely giving prospects and new customers the confidence to engage with us.
And I was spending some time on your website earlier and I saw the big call to action there to get a free churn analysis, which is a very, very good marketing tactic. Can you talk to us about what that does exactly and where that data is coming from and how it really pulls that data and does that analysis?
Yeah, so that's a fascinating aspect of our platform. So the way it works is, let's say, you had an unfortunate churn, so you lost a customer. What we would do is we would run kind of like a proof of concept where we would connect to a certain number of your communication channels. For example, it could be, let's say, your email system, it could be support tickets. Maybe we would pull in some transcripts from calls. And if you have any other analytic signals like product usage and so on. And then that's pretty much it. That's what we need from you. We will then take it from there. We'll pull historical data and do an analysis that will look at certain dimensions of the interaction or engagement. And then we'll be able to tell you a story. So for example, we had a prospect that then converted to a customer. We had them tell us about a churn of a large 6-figure customer. And when we analyzed it in the system, we saw 4 weeks back, we saw a number of incidents. We saw the account manager change twice over a 4-month period. We saw the champion or, the counterpart, the decision maker on the other side, lose kind of interest or go dark on the new account manager. So we saw, several outreaches. Then we saw some negative sentiment and support issues with another aspect of the customer. So all that together, when the renewal came, led to an unfortunate outcome where decision maker was not engaged because, account manager changed and they weren't able to create a relationship. Support wasn't able to deliver and solve a problem. And just overall sentiment from the customer side was not there. Now, if this had been, if you could use staircase in real time, somewhere along this journey, we would raise a flag and say, somebody needs to step up here, step in, maybe on an executive level or something like that, and reset this whole incident.
Can you paint a picture for us of what it's like right now to be a customer success leader at a SaaS company?
It's a lot of responsibility. It always has been. It's one of the most difficult jobs out there. In most SaaS companies, especially after the early growth stage, most of the revenue is coming from, the existing customer base. And that job of making sure that the customers are seeing the value and are going to renew and expand has a lot of importance and weight over the whole entire organization. So there's a lot of firefighting, and right now there's a lot of negotiating because everyone is, in this macro climate, customers are basically looking for discounts if they're, still interested in renewing. They are challenging value on a constant basis. That means they have to explain internally to their organizations why they need to buy a certain tool or service. And then they sometimes have to go back to the customer success organization and say, listen, we need this and this, otherwise we can't, continue our relationship. There's a lot of competition out there. We talked about generative AI, but there are a lot of tools that are coming out, and that is causing a lot of friction on a product level. So customer success, that job is very multifaceted, right? You have to understand human relationships, and you have to be really good at that. You have to be able to understand the product and the service around it that you're selling. You have to be kind of an expert in that. Otherwise, the customer doesn't, really value you. And you have to be able to maneuver your organization internally to adapt and change to any signals you're seeing out there in the field.
This show is brought to you by Frontlines Media, a podcast production studio that helps B2B founders launch, manage, and grow their own podcast. Now, if you're a founder, you may be thinking, I don't have time to host a podcast. I've got a company to build. Well, that's exactly what we built our service to do. You show up and host, and we handle literally everything else. To set up a call to discuss launching your own podcast, visit frontlines.io/podcast. Now, back to today's episode.
Let's talk a little bit about market categories now. So when I introduced you as a customer intelligence and analytics platform. I think I pulled that maybe somewhere from LinkedIn. Is that the category, or what is the market category, or how do you think about market category today?
Yeah, that definitely, we look at the revenue intelligence category, but with a focus on the customer and, versus sales. So post-sales world. So in some ways it is a new category. There've been a category of tools and the customer success and support, but there's been a lack of intelligence. And as I told my personal story, when I was leading, a customer success or post-sales organization, I lacked that intelligence. And in the sales world, there's some equivalents to that, forecasting tools and so on. In the post-sale world, there are some challenges that have yet to be overcome. And part of it is because it's a more complex problem to solve, right? The post-sale world is very noisy. You have a lot of signals, you have a lot of people interacting, you have history, you have product experience, and so on and so forth. So the category is a relatively, new one, emerging, I would say. But with what's happening right now in the trend of sales intelligence, data, and, intelligence in general, analytics, it's just naturally forming. And if you think of the future, I think everyone envisions in the future a place where you have the sentient kind of system that is constantly analyzing every signal possible to help you work with your customers and your prospects.
In terms of go-to-market, I'm sure there's been a couple of challenges along the way. But if we had to pick one challenge that you faced so far and you've largely overcome, what would that challenge be, and how'd you overcome it?
So I think an interesting experiment we went through as a startup is we started PLG last year and realized very quickly that that's not, working for us. And we were kind of mesmerized by the idea of, the whole PLG, approach. But about a few weeks into it, we saw traction. That means we had signups and all that good stuff that you measure PLG, but we realized that we were hitting a wall. And part of it was, by analyzing it really carefully, we're twofold. One is we access kind of sensitive data, and in order to spread it in an organization, we have to go through security and privacy, and that, is kind of a blocker for the PLG flow. The second was that, our buyer is typically a high-level manager, and those folks don't always go around signing up for products and services, just off the web. They're very busy. And we basically had to kind of shut that down, shift to a more kind of enterprise sales approach. And then, and that's kind of how we've done that. So Q4, was quite a challenging quarter for us because we had to really kind of turn our whole go-to-market, both messaging, approach, build kind of our upper funnel in Q1. And now in Q2 and Q3, we're actually seeing it starting to work. We're seeing, strong demand. We're talking to the right people. The ACVs are much larger. And, there's a process in place that can sometimes take, a few months to close a deal, but it's worth it.
I feel like more and more founders and more companies are going to share that experience over the coming months where, they got kind of bit by the PLG bug a few years ago because that's all you could read everywhere, right? Everywhere on LinkedIn, all over the media, investors, all over Twitter, everyone was talking about PLG as, kind of the savior. And I think a lot of companies kind of moved into that because the benefits just sound insane when you really see them listed out. But I think that just for a lot of companies, it hasn't worked out as they anticipated. So I don't think you're alone there in having those PLG challenges.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think it was almost like the holy grail PLG, right? And if you can't build PLG, then there's something wrong. But I must say that, when you're kind of leading a startup, and one of our principles is really fail fast. It's not about not failing. And that's a tough one for your ego because we all, don't like to fail. A lot of us are A-types and, we just want it to succeed. But it's more important to look really clearly at the data in front of you and say, hey, this is not working. Nobody's to blame here, but we really need to change course quickly. And I think that that's one of the things that, we're successful from a cultural perspective, at Staircase is that it's okay to fail. But if it is a failure, we got to raise that flag early. So PLG was definitely in that respect, not a success. We learned a lot from it and it enabled us to kind of pivot into a direct sales enterprise approach that we know and feel is the right fit right now.
How fast did you fail there? Are we talking like you had the idea, you rolled it out, then it was 6 months later, or was it 3 months later? What was that like general time frame?
It was more like 2 months because it took a while. And at the beginning, you don't know if the PLG is not where you're doing something wrong in the PLG, if the product's not right or something like that. So we experimented with that, but we also looked at the type of personas that were signing up. And we saw very quickly that we're not getting any kind of managerial level signups. So that was a red flag. So we thought maybe it was the messaging. So we played around with that. And then we just got to a conclusion that maybe this is not working, partly because we also, again, from like a security and privacy perspective. So one of the things about Staircase is the fact that, we get to share a lot of the data internally, right? So I get to see your emails, you get to see mine, I get to see the tickets of the organization. So that sharing aspect is really important for us to be able to provide value. So an individual kind of value proposition is great for PLG, but when you need kind of a company-wide or an organization-wide, data sharing approach, it's very hard to spread in an organization like that.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, let's just imagine you were starting the company again today from scratch. What would be the number one piece of advice you'd give to yourself?
Wow. I think just bring talent into areas that, you're not familiar, early on as possible. I think I was both Leo, my co-founder, and I, we were trying to cover as much ground and, we had really strong technical and product, knowledge and maybe some areas of the go-to-market, marketing, finance, all that. It was a lot of learning kind of, on the job, quote unquote. I read a lot of books, I talked to a lot of friends and so on and so forth. But if, we brought in perhaps another individual, if she or he were someone who had that experience, I think it would have shortened the curve. You see, because a startup is really all about time, right? The minute you get that funding, your clock is ticking and you need to show results quickly. So it's really to go in with whatever, talent, you can acquire as early possible. I will say that when we started off, it was very, very competitive. It was kind of the midst of Corona, COVID, and startups were flourishing. Funding was everywhere, and it was very hard to get really good talent. But I think that would be one thing, expand, maybe not the founder team necessarily, but that also, I'm totally open to that. But the managerial team early on, because, a strong group with experience can accelerate.
When I was playing around on the site earlier as well, I did notice the messaging is really strong. The copy is really clear. I went through the resources. You're running all of the right tactics. How long did it take you to really get the marketing dialed in like that? Because now when I look at it, it looks great. Was it like that from day one, or how long did it take to get to this point?
No, nothing's like this in day one. No, we have a great team in general. I think in every facet, we're a small team. We're 10 people, and every person, is just amazing. And so is our, head of marketing. And, we just did a lot of experimentation, a lot of analytics. That means that the approach is very data driven. And I know, people say that ad nauseum these days, but really sometimes, I don't even want to look at the data, but I'm forced to. So there was a lot of A/B testing, a lot of thinking, a lot of testing, of trying, and sometimes I'm impatient. Like I'll be like, no, we got to change the messaging because we're not seeing any traction. And, and marketing or sales will say, okay, listen, give it like 2 weeks or 3 weeks and so on. So there's this give and take discussion that's constantly going on. And the thing is that you're not in a bubble, right? There's a macro environment around you. When we started off, things were great, in the macro. End of last year, things started to look pretty bad. And that, the messaging had to adapt. And we were adapting, there's so many variables that are changing. It was, at times it was a little overwhelming, right? The product was changing from PLG to enterprise. We were rebuilding our funnel. We were changing features in the product because, PLG product is different than an enterprise product. The core was obviously the same. So it was quite a journey. And to be honest, I don't know if, the messaging is perfect right now. Like right now, we're still exchanging, new ideas about messaging, how to expand and how to talk to, new verticals and new. So it never ends.
Yeah, I think that's consistent with everyone that I've talked to. The messaging is never done. Yeah, it changes every 3 months, every 6 months, whatever it is. It's always evolving as the market changes. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, final question for you. Let's zoom out into the future. So let's go maybe 3 to 5 years from today. Can you just paint a picture for us? What is that high-level vision and that big picture vision that you're building?
Yeah, I say to folks, imagine a world in 3 to 5 years where you don't have to log anything manually. You don't have to kind of sit with some system of record and kind of just everything is kind of counted for, tested, analyzed for you. I see ourselves as kind of in the forefront of what we call this artificial customer intelligence. So it's kind of like a sentient, I would say, augmenting people. And, it's a platform and it can not only provide intelligence and insights, but it can also provide action and to some degree, maybe mimic people, but not taking, not in a scary way, like not taking away jobs or things like that, but just making us more efficient in our work.
Amazing. Well, we are up on time, so we're going to have to wrap here. Before we do, if any founders listening in want to follow along with your journey as you build and execute on this vision, where should they go?
So yeah, please follow us on LinkedIn, on Staircase AI, and then also we have our various blogs. And also feel free to reach out to me, typically on LinkedIn. And yeah, I'm excited to interact with everyone and anyone. And yeah, I wish everyone out there, good luck. These are challenging times, but exciting ones too.
Totally agree. Ori, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. Really enjoyed this, and I know the audience is going to as well.
Thanks a lot, Brett. It's great being here.
All right, keep in touch.
This episode of Category Visionaries is brought to you by Frontlines Media, Silicon Valley's leading podcast production studio. If you're a B2B founder looking for help launching and growing your own podcast, visit frontlines.io/podcast. And for the latest episode, search for Category Visionaries on your podcast platform of choice. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.